Candace Owens stepped into Congress expecting a standard procedural hearing, yet what unfolded stunned the entire room as she faced Ilhan Omar and a panel poised for confrontation. Candace met every inquiry with a poised assurance that nobody had anticipated. And when she dropped that singular statement, the chamber went quiet, while the internet erupted. In a mere 37 seconds, the dynamic shifted entirely, as one voice assumed command, while the opposition found themselves without a rebuttal. Before we dive in, let us know your location in the comments, and remember to subscribe for these unpredictable moments. Nobody inside that hearing chamber realized it at the time, but the upcoming 37 seconds were destined to completely overturn the narrative the Democrats believed they owned. You could sense the atmosphere thickening with a quiet strain that people try to ignore, the sort that hides behind artificial smiles and anxious movements. Candace Owens didn't enter Congress seeking a conflict. She arrived with the air of someone who already understood the outcome. She appeared calm, distinct, and unbothered, and that sheer confidence unnerved the room before she uttered a single word. However, this is the crucial detail you must focus on regarding this entire standoff. This whole confrontation boils down to one unresolved query, a single instance that refuses to unveil itself until the story's very conclusion. It is the specific instant that sent the Democrats into a panic, the split second that caused the aides in the back to pause and instantly altered the hearing's mood. You will comprehend the reason once we reach that point, but for the moment, it all began with an attitude designed to daunt her. A Democrat leaned in with a slow cadence, attempting to provoke a response from her. Everyone identified the strategy, which was to construct a snare, compel a mistake, and manufacture a headline. "Are you a conservative?" Without a second of hesitation, she confirmed she is. When asked if she is pro-life, she confirmed she is, and she affirmed her Christian faith just as quickly. Every response arrived with precision, lacking any wobble, apology, or attempt to soften the blow. The panel was unprepared for such directness, as they had anticipated defensiveness or perhaps justifications. Instead, she handled the inquiries as if they were simple equations she had previously calculated. You could practically hear the tension ratcheting up in the seats as the atmosphere transformed. Then arrived the jab they believed would leave her with no escape. "Do you harbor hatred for Americans with black skin?" The aide's gaze snapped up, recognizing it as a charged statement crafted to trap her in a defensive stance or a labeled box. Yet Candace refused to take the emotional bait, and instead leaned into the moment with absolute clarity. "Absolutely not," she replied, stating she loved them enough to offer them the unvarnished truth. A handful of people actually ceased typing on their devices, as that was not the response they had scripted for her. The inquiries continued to flow regarding white Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and the LGBTQ community, with each one tailored to spark outrage or inconsistency. Instead, she addressed them with the identical steady cadence, offering no hatred, no exclusions, and no fractures in her resolve. Then the chairman attempted a fresh approach, but utilized a different variety of attack. "You openly align yourself with purveyors of hate," he stated. Candace did not flinch, and the smile she offered him was devoid of sarcasm. It was something more acute, something that signaled to the room she had been readying herself for that statement long before he chose to utter it. The instant she responded marked where the hearing genuinely commenced. That is the specific moment leading straight to the turning point you will witness at the conclusion. Right after this exchange, and the chairman's accusation met her calm retort, everything within that chamber shifted. Even the manner in which the Democrats glanced at one another altered, and the countdown started toward those 37 seconds that induced their panic. The chairman believed he possessed the advantage as he aligned his documents, cleared his throat, and presented the line he thought would shatter her poise. It was the sort of allegation that typically sends witnesses rushing to explain themselves, softening their voices, or even apologizing for perceptions they never meant. "You openly associate with purveyors of hate," he repeated. The room anticipated tension, perhaps a flare of temper or a nervous gulp. However, what occurred instead is the instance every individual in that chamber recalls. It demonstrated to them that Candace Owens was not acting out the part they had designated for her. She raised her gaze, maintained his stare for a fleeting second longer, and delivered a response so composed it felt like a counterstrike in slow motion. "By your definition, sir, a purveyor of hate is anybody who backs the president." A ripple traveled through the room, not merely a sound wave, but an emotional current. A few Democrats adjusted in their chairs while someone at the table's edge pursed their lips as if tasting something bitter. The chairman did not anticipate her interpreting the charge, inverting it, and handing it directly back to him with such discipline. Then she proceeded, steady and exact, stating she supports him because he assisted Black Americans, something your party has failed to do in decades. That served as the first genuine blow of the hearing, a strike that was neither emotional nor theatrical. It was simply factual enough and presented with sufficient conviction that you could observe the impact taking hold instantly. An aide in the rear glanced up, another tapped a pen against a notepad, and someone else leaned in as if ensuring they missed none of the fallout. The chairman attempted to salvage the situation with a gentler tone, suggesting they reframe the shift, and asking how the president has aided the Black community. He anticipated she might hesitate, or perhaps stall, yet she did not even blink. He reduced Black unemployment to its lowest recorded level in history. Millions moved off food stamp programs, and families were finally getting back on their feet. Each point landed with that identical clean accuracy. She was not elevating her volume, nor was she attempting to dazzle anyone. She merely articulated what she held to be true. That honesty and clarity rendered the panel uneasy in a manner that arguments never could achieve. When she noted that Black America was suffering under Democrat leadership, the hearing pivoted once more. A soft thud resonated as someone dropped a pen, while another sat back with arms crossed and eyes narrowing. The Democrats realized what was unfolding. They were not merely questioning her anymore, for she was questioning their entire narrative right before their eyes. Then arrived the moment that established the groundwork for the ensuing panic. "The most significant issue in our community is the absence of fathers," she stated, "and the political left manufactured it." That sentence did not detonate loudly, but rather it landed like a relentless wave that refuses to cease once it begins. You could sense the unease propagating from chair to chair. They were unprepared for that degree of bluntness, nor were they ready for someone who did not fear their labels, their framing, or their snares. The clock continued ticking toward those 37 seconds, the instant when everything they dreaded would finally emerge. The chairman attempted to stabilize himself following that final impact, yet everyone could witness the transition taking place. It was not loud or chaotic, but rather subtle, almost too faint unless you were observing closely. There was a stiffening of shoulders, a few glances exchanged across the table, and a quiet rustling as staffers moved closer to their monitors, suddenly realizing they might need to record every word she spoke. Candace had achieved something rare by seizing control of the tempo, and Democrats detest losing the pace. One of them leaned in, attempting to reclaim it with a softer tone, but a sharp inquiry. "Do you believe conservatives are ever culpable of hatred or bigotry?" It was a tactical maneuver to shift the dialogue from her strength to a topic where they assumed she would stumble. She did not stumble. She responded with the same directness she had maintained from the beginning. There are hateful individuals everywhere on every side. But in every conservative room I have addressed, at every event and every tour, I discuss the necessity of Black Americans standing on their own feet, and they applaud. Someone in the second row blinked slowly, almost in a state of disbelief. It was not the content that stunned them, but the delivery. She was not defensive or angry. She was speaking like someone who had been asked the identical question 1,000 times and had long since ceased to be annoyed by it. "And they applaud," she repeated, somewhat quieter this time. The repetition was not for emphasis, but because she genuinely meant it. A Democrat at the far end of the table sighed, a sound barely audible, which was not frustration, but something closer to disappointment. The line of questioning was intended to place her on the defensive, but instead, she had transformed it into another platform. Then another member interjected with a more pointed voice, asserting that surely she has witnessed hate from the conservatives she supports. A few heads lifted, as this was supposed to be the trap. If she denied it, they would label her dishonest. If she agreed, they would utilize her words against her base. She did neither. I have witnessed anger, fear, and frustration, but hatred, no. When I inform conservatives that Black Americans merit better than political dependency, they do not push back, they cheer. That is something the political left cannot tolerate. An aide scribbled something rapidly, then paused mid-sentence. It was becoming evident that every effort to trip her only rendered her answers sharper. Then she introduced the topic they least desired her to mention. A student's dorm was set ablaze because he was a member of a Turning Point USA chapter. We are advocating for capitalism, free markets, and personal responsibility. Yet somehow that is categorized as hate speech. A murmur traveled through the back rows, not loud, but undeniably present. They realized she was not exaggerating, and they understood the example carried weight. Worst of all, they knew it struck one of the largest vulnerabilities on their side, which is political violence stemming from their own activists. The Democrats began trading glances once more, as if a silent inquiry was bouncing between them, asking if she was going to cease. But she was not stopping, not yet, because the moment that induced their panic, the 37-second shift, had not arrived, not even close. By now, everyone in that hearing chamber could sense it. The momentum had tilted so severely toward Candace that the Democrats were no longer attempting to win, but rather trying to stem the bleeding. You could observe it in the manner they adjusted their chairs, straightened their ties, and tapped their pens with excessive force. All the customary confidence had evaporated, replaced by something quieter and closer to concern. Then, one of the Democrats attempted a different tactic, a reset. When you are losing a battle of ideas, you switch to tone. When tone fails, you switch to optics. When optics fail, you attempt to alter the field entirely. "Ms. Owens," he began with a voice intentionally steady, noting that she had been disinvited from campuses numerous times. Someone on the panel nodded subtly as if signaling this is the angle that will succeed. Candace did not waste a second. "All the time," she replied, "for the reason of being conservative." The simplicity of her answer rendered the panel uneasy. They anticipated she would guide them through emotional tales or dramatic incidents that they could frame as exaggeration. Instead, she clipped it clean with one cut, no dressing, and no theatrics. He tried again, asking if she would consider that a form of political hatred. "Yes," she answered, adding that we are not discussing it nearly enough. That line did not merely drop, it landed hard. For the first time, she had turned the direction of the hearing away from herself and aimed it squarely at them. The Democrats were no longer interrogating. They were being interrogated passively and quietly, without realizing they had stepped into the position they usually controlled. She continued before anyone could interrupt. Conservative activists are being attacked, students are being threatened, and events are being shut down. I have faced Antifa simply for speaking at a college. 3 chapters promised violence, and a student's dorm was ignited for being part of a turning point chapter. Silence followed, the kind of silence that exposes whether a room is truly listening or merely waiting to speak. What made this moment perilous for them was not the content, but the calmness. She was not pleading for sympathy, nor was she angry. She was laying out facts without an ounce of emotional weight. That is exactly what made each word heavier. A Democrat who had been flipping through notes finally looked up, realizing none of the talking points in front of him applied anymore. Candace had shifted the conversation entirely from labels to treatment, and from accusations to reality. That shift was exactly what they did not want. Because the moment you place actions under a spotlight, narratives begin losing their power. Then came the line that made the tension in the room tighten like a rope being pulled from both ends. All we advocate is opportunity, free markets, and personal responsibility. That is our message, she stated. She paused before adding that somehow that is considered hate speech. A slow exhale drifted across the front row. Someone's jaw clenched while someone else tapped their pen again, harder this time. They were losing control of the narrative they expected to dominate. Still, the moment that would make them panic, the one that would send a shock through the chamber in just 37 seconds, still hadn't arrived. It was getting closer, though, so close the room could feel it. Everything in the room shifted again when the next Democrat leaned forward. He didn't shuffle papers, he didn't clear his throat, and he didn't even pretend to smile. He was done with the earlier tones that were soft, probing, and polite. This time he went straight for the question the entire panel had been circling but never fully asked. Do you believe you associate with hate, Miss Owens? Not your supporters or conservatives, but you. It was an attempt at a direct hit, a final one, and for the first time in the hearing, even the people in the back row stopped taking notes. Candace didn't move, didn't blink, and didn't shift. Her answer came with the same calm clarity she had carried from the start. No, I have zero tolerance for hate from anyone. It was simple, clean, and unshakable. And that was the moment the Democrats realized something they had been trying to ignore. They couldn't provoke her. They tried labeling. They tried moral framing. They tried the gotcha approach. And they tried isolation tactics, but none of it worked. So he tried again, insisting that surely she has encountered extremists on the right or seen hateful rhetoric. The panel leaned in, thinking they finally found a crack. Candace didn't give them one. I have spoken at conservative events 3 times a week for years. I talk about Black empowerment. I talk about family structure. And I talk about personal responsibility. And every time, every single time, they applaud. Her tone was almost conversational, which only made the words sharper. Another member chimed in quickly, hoping to break the flow. Well, you don't deny white supremacists exist, do you? Of course not, she replied. Just like I don't deny Nazis exist, or violent groups on any side. They should all be condemned. But don't pretend it's conservatives attacking speakers, setting fires, and shutting down events, because that is coming from your side. There it was, a clean line drawn straight across the room. A staffer near the wall actually paused mid-typing, as if unsure whether to continue or just watch. Candace leaned in slightly, not aggressively, but with intent. When I tell conservatives that Black Americans aren't owned by the left, they don't get angry. They clap because they want us to thrive, and they want us to rise. That is what scares you. A ripple of tension moved through the panel. Someone shifted in their seat, while someone else tightened their jaw. You could feel the internal question echoing through them. How do we redirect this? But there was nowhere to redirect. She had locked the room into a truth no one expected to hear, delivered with this much composure. Then, she delivered the line that made the problem in the room unmistakable. You don't hate me because I'm wrong. You hate me because I'm not controlled. It was not shouted or dramatized, just stated. A slow, heavy silence followed. No one wanted to break at first, not after that. But that silence is exactly what leads into the real moment, the 37 seconds that made Democrats panic. And whether the room realized it or not, that moment was now only inches away. Up to this point, the Democrats had taken hits that were clean, precise, and unexpected, but they were still in the fight. They were still trying to regain footing, still shuffling through notes, and still hoping the momentum would tilt back in their direction if they could just find the right angle. They hadn't panicked yet, but that changed when Candace delivered the line that exposed the problem at its core. A Democrat tried one last reset. Miss Owens, surely you understand why people feel threatened by your rhetoric. That was supposed to be the lifeline, the polite framing, and the pivot back to emotional territory where they felt strongest. But the moment the question left his mouth, Candace exhaled gently like someone who'd heard the same argument 100 times and finally decided it was time to put the entire thing to rest. They feel threatened, she said, because I refuse to play the role they wrote for me. A few heads lifted, not because the words were loud, but because they were sharper than they expected. She continued, steady as ever. Everything you're calling hate is really just me refusing to be a victim. It hit with the weight of a truth the room wasn't prepared for. A staffer in the back looked up from their phone while another froze mid-scroll. Candace didn't stop. Your party needs people like me angry, dependent, and afraid, not thinking for themselves. Because if they ever wake up and realize how much they've been manipulated, your political power collapses. Someone on the panel shifted aggressively, the legs of his chair scraping the floor. The chairman's expression tightened. A woman on the left side pressed her lips together hard, as if holding back an interruption. Candace leaned slightly forward, not confrontational, but unignorable. That's why you hate me. It's not because of my views, it's because I say the quiet part out loud. A visible ripple went through the room. This was different from her earlier points. This wasn't about unemployment, or college campuses, or political violence. This was about control. Who holds it, who benefits from it, and who refuses to play along. Then she went even further. You don't panic when conservatives speak. You panic when a black conservative speaks because that threatens your entire narrative. A sharp quiet fell over the chamber. Someone's pen dropped while someone else swallowed hard. A staffer muttered something under their breath, scrambling to adjust their notes. And for the first time, the Democrats didn't jump in to respond. They didn't cut her off, they didn't redirect, and they didn't challenge the statement. They froze because she didn't attack individuals. She dismantled the foundation of the argument they spent years building. And she did it with a calmness that made it impossible to dismiss as emotion. In that silence, something shifted, not just tension or discomfort, but something deeper. That was the moment the panic began, quiet at first, hidden behind forced expressions and tightened posture, but real. Because they knew the next question, the one coming after this moment, would be the one that triggered the full 37-second collapse. The chairman tried to speak, but for the first time all hearing, his voice didn't come out immediately. He adjusted his microphone, cleared his throat, and shifted a paper that didn't actually need shifting. He wasn't buying time for himself. He was buying time for the room because everyone felt it now. The temperature wasn't rising and the walls weren't shaking, but the energy had shifted into something unmistakable. Unease. Then he finally managed to get the words out. "Miss Owens, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask one more question." It sounded neutral enough, but the tone was wrong. Too careful, too measured, and too aware. Candace gave a simple nod. "Go ahead." He leaned closer to the microphone, and here is where the moment that would send Democrats into a panic truly began. Do you believe your support for the former president contributes to division in this country? Silence and stillness followed. Every eye in the room locked on her. It wasn't the question itself, it was the framing behind it. They wanted her to walk straight into the trap, either criticizing Trump or doubling down in a way they could exploit. But Candace did something nobody on that panel predicted. She corrected the premise entirely. Division doesn't come from supporting a president, she said calmly. Division comes from those who refuse to accept that Black Americans can think for themselves. The room snapped to attention. A few Democrats shifted uncomfortably while a staffer pressed his lips together, typing something fast. Candace continued before they could breathe. Black Americans succeeding does not divide the country. You treating that success as a threat does. A small ripple traveled across the panel, causing tightened fingers and stiffened shoulders. She wasn't raising her voice or grandstanding. She was slicing through the argument with surgical precision. Then she said the line that triggered the beginning of the 37-second collapse. You don't fear division, you fear independence. It hit so fast and so clean that nobody spoke. Not one Democrat, not one staffer, and not one member of the audience. Candace let the silence sit for a beat longer, then delivered the follow-up that turned discomfort into full panic. When Black Americans stop depending on your party, your influence disappears. That's what this is really about. There it was, the truth they couldn't interrupt, couldn't spin, and couldn't soften. A direct, unfiltered, and unavoidable blow. One Democrat's face flushed red, while another looked down and began flipping papers that didn't need flipping. A staffer whispered something urgently, pointing toward the chairman. Someone in the second row leaned forward, elbow on knee, hand covering their mouth. The room wasn't just tense anymore. It was destabilized. This exact stretch was the moment the panic began, and the next few seconds would only make it worse. The chairman tried to recover, but the damage was already spreading like a quiet shockwave across the panel. Candace's last line about fearing independence was still hanging in the air. Every Democrat in that room felt the weight of it, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was the one accusation they couldn't counter without proving it true. He shuffled his papers again, attempting to look composed, but the rhythm was off. His hand paused mid-motion, then resumed, then paused again. Small signs of a mind trying to regain control that wasn't there anymore. Before he could formulate a follow-up, another Democrat jumped in too quickly. "Well, Miss Owens, you speak about independence, but surely you understand why some people—" He didn't finish. Candace cut in gently, not rudely or sharply, just firmly enough to remind the room who was actually steering the moment. "I understand why people feel threatened by truth, particularly when that truth exposes political dependency." The Democrat paused, stunned by how easily she intercepted the narrative. He blinked twice, unsure how to continue. A staffer behind him sank a little lower in his chair. Candace continued before anyone regained footing. "You call it division," she said, "but what you're really afraid of is accountability." Someone in the room exhaled sharply. Someone else muttered, "Oh no," under their breath. Another began flipping through a binder, as if an answer might magically appear in one of the pages. Candace kept her tone calm and measured. "You've built an entire political strategy on convincing my community that progress is impossible without you, that success requires supervision, and that opportunity must be handed out from this building instead of earned out in the real world." A wave of discomfort moved across the panel. You could see it in the way shoulders shifted, eyes darted, and breaths tightened. For the first time, they weren't listening to debate. They were confronting exposure. Then she added something that deepened the crack. "Every time I speak to conservatives about black excellence, about black families, about black entrepreneurship, they cheer. They don't call me a threat. They call me an American." A staffer typed furiously, stopped, deleted half the sentence, then typed again, completely thrown off rhythm. Candace's next line worsened the unraveling. "When conservatives hear me speak, they hear potential. When you hear me speak, you hear disobedience." That sentence hit the room like a dropped weight. A woman on the panel crossed her arms tightly. A man beside her scratched his forehead, avoiding eye contact. The chairman leaned back slightly, the discomfort settling deeper into his posture. Candace wasn't raising her voice, she wasn't performing. She was laying out an argument so clean and so direct that no one could interrupt without looking defensive. And then she delivered the line that triggered a deeper level of panic. "You needed me to fit a stereotype. I don't. And that's why this hearing isn't going the way you planned." Someone gasped quietly. Another stared straight ahead, expression frozen. A staffer whispered urgently to someone on the panel, pointing at a note on the table because they all knew something now. The hearing wasn't slipping away. It was already gone. And the moment that would complete the 37-second collapse was now only moments away. By now, the hearing had slipped completely out of the Democrats' control. And every person in that room understood it, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. The rhythm was gone. The planned questions were useless. The talking points, carefully printed and highlighted, no longer applied to the moment unfolding in front of them. What made it worse was that Candace wasn't escalating. She wasn't shouting, and she wasn't mocking anyone. She was calm, steady, and impossibly composed. And that made every sentence she delivered feel heavier than the last. A Democrat who hadn't spoken yet tried to reclaim the floor. His voice was tight, stretched just enough to reveal the pressure underneath. "Ms. Owens, you're suggesting we dislike independent thought. That's quite an accusation." Candace didn't flinch. "It's not an accusation," she said. "It's an observation." That answer struck harder than if she'd raised her voice. Observations can't be dismissed as emotional attacks. They linger. They demand a response, and the panel struggled to find one. The Democrat tried again, forcing a shaky smile. "Well, surely you must understand why some people feel your rhetoric is harmful." Candace tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet disbelief. "Harmful to what?" she asked. "Harmful to the political advantage you gain from keeping Black Americans dependent?" The man froze. His mouth opened slightly, but the words never formed. A staffer, 2 seats behind him, scribbled something quickly, then crossed it out. Then scribbled again. Candace continued pressing forward with the same calm pace that had dismantled every line of questioning so far. "When you call self-reliance dangerous, what you're really saying is that freedom threatens your influence." A small shockwave passed through the row of Democrats. Someone shifted in their seat, someone else swallowed audibly, and another shot a sideways glance at the chairman, silently begging for a lifeline. Candace didn't wait for one. "You don't attack my ideas because they're extreme," she said. "You attack them because they work. And if they work, your entire narrative falls apart." The words landed with a clarity that silenced even the whispers in the back row. Then came the sentence that accelerated the collapse. "Progress isn't a threat. Losing control is, and that's why you're panicking." That word, panicking, hit like a strike right to the center of the room. Not shouted, not emphasized, just spoken plainly as if she were stating the weather. A woman on the panel looked down and closed her binder. A man beside her rubbed the bridge of his nose, eyes closed for a moment longer than a blink. Even the chairman leaned back in his seat, lips pressed into a thin line. Candace's voice stayed level. "You built a system that resets in Black Americans to fail, so you can claim to save us. When someone shows up proving that failure isn't our destiny, you don't know what to do." Another staffer dropped his pen. Someone in the back let out a quiet, frustrated exhale. The panic was no longer subtle. It was visible. And just when the room thought she might pause, she delivered the line that ended the illusion of control. "You're not upset that I'm conservative. You're upset that I'm free." Total silence followed. No shuffling, no paper sounds, no whispered instructions. Just a room full of people realizing the narrative had not only slipped, it had shattered. And now, nothing stood between them and the final moment. The last section of the 37-second fallout. The room had gone so still that even the cameras seemed quieter. Candace's last line about being free had cracked something open, and no one on the panel had figured out how to put it back together. But the real collapse, the moment that would echo long after the hearing ended, wasn't the silence that followed. It was what happened next. The chairman leaned forward again, both hands clasped tightly together. He looked down at his notes, then up at Candace, then back down again. He was searching for a final question, something sharp enough to regain control, but safe enough not to backfire. Nothing in front of him worked. Nothing he rehearsed applied anymore. So he chose the only thing he thought might land. "Ms. Owens, do you believe patriotism belongs to your side?" "Is that what you're saying?" There it was, a question designed to corner her into sounding arrogant, tribal, or extreme. A question meant to make her walk straight into their final frame. But Candace didn't hesitate, didn't shift, and didn't blink. She lifted her chin slightly, and her voice dropped into a calm, grounded tone that carried to the back of the chamber. "Patriotism doesn't belong to a side. It belongs to anyone who loves this country enough to tell the truth." The first second passed, and a subtle jolt moved through the panel. "So yes," she continued, "I'll say it plainly. Conservatives are patriots. The president is a patriot, and there is no skin color in patriotism." The second passed. Someone in the second row swallowed hard. "No one owns love for this country," she said, "but some people fear losing it." The third second passed. A staffer whispered urgently to the chairman, who ignored him. "And when you call that love hateful," she added, "you expose what you really fear. Americans thinking for themselves." 4 seconds, then 5, then 6. The silence grew thicker. No one moved. Not one Democrat dared jump in. Candace continued, her voice steady enough to reveal the moment's full weight. "You tried to paint me as hateful, as dangerous, as someone spreading division. But here's the truth you didn't expect to hear today." This was the start of the final 31 seconds. the stretch that made Democrats actually panic. I am not controlled by you. I am not defined by you. And I am not here to fit the role you wrote for me. Someone exhaled sharply. Another tightened their jaw. The chairman shifted in his seat. Candace delivered the final line that completed the collapse. I am here because I love this country enough to defend it, even from the people who claimed to protect it. That was it. The moment the panic became unmistakable. A woman on the panel closed her folder and pushed it away. A man beside her leaned back with arms crossed and expression frozen. Two staffers began whispering urgently behind the chairman, one pointing toward the exit while the other shook his head. Someone in the audience let out a quiet, stunned sound of amazement that the microphone still caught. The chairman cleared his throat, his voice shaken, stating they would move on. But the room didn't move on, not internally, not mentally, and not politically. Because in just 37 seconds, Candace Owens didn't just defend herself, she exposed the weakness in their narrative, took control of their hearing, and forced an entire panel of Democrats to confront the one thing they never expected: a woman they couldn't intimidate, couldn't silence, and couldn't control. And as the gavel tapped lightly, lacking any confidence, the hearing ended with everyone knowing the same thing. Candace Owens didn't walk out burned. She walked out victorious. The silence of the hearing room was instantly replaced by the chaotic hum of the corridor as the heavy doors swung open to the press. Reporters who had been monitoring the feed from the monitors outside were already scrambling into position, sensing that history had just been made. Candace walked through the crowd not with the air of someone who had just survived a battle, but like someone who had commanded it. The cameras flashed in a relentless strobe, capturing a demeanor that was neither arrogant nor shaken, just purely resolved. Back inside, the committee members lingered at their desks, shuffling papers and speaking in hushed tones, delaying their exit to avoid the immediate barrage of questions waiting for them. The contrast between the two exits told the entire story of the day without a single word being spoken. While Candace moved through the swarm of microphones with steady grace, the Democrats eventually slipped out through side doors or moved quickly with heads down, avoiding eye contact with the media they usually courted. They knew that any soundbite they gave now would only be juxtaposed against the masterclass in composure they had just lost to. The narrative they had prepared for the evening news was effectively dead, killed by the raw footage that was already making its way to the internet. It wasn't just a political defeat, it was a total optical collapse that no amount of post-hearing spin could fix. Within minutes, the clip of those critical 37 seconds began circulating on social media, moving faster than the mainstream networks could contextualize it. Phones across the country lit up as notifications spread the moment from one platform to another, bypassing the editorial filters that usually control the message. People who had never tuned into a congressional hearing in their lives were suddenly watching a breakdown of the political machine in real time. The comment sections didn't just explode, they unified, filled with viewers from every background acknowledging that they had just witnessed truth speak to power. It became the kind of viral moment that doesn't just trend for a few hours but gets etched into the digital archive permanently. Back in the offices of the staffers who had prepped the questions, the mood was likely shifting from confusion to genuine crisis management. They had built a trap, assuming their target would be volatile, emotional, and easy to caricature, but they had severely miscalculated their opponent. Every attempt to paint her as extreme had only highlighted her rationality, and every attempt to silence her had only amplified her voice. The strategy meetings that followed must have been tense, as they realized their standard playbook for character assassination had been rendered useless on live television. They weren't just losing a news cycle, They were losing the ability to define the terms of the engagement. The legacy of that hearing wasn't about legislation or policy. It was about the shattering of a long-held illusion regarding who is allowed to think independently. Candace proved that you could stand alone in a room full of hostile authority figures and dismantle their worldview simply by refusing to apologize for your own. The fear in the room wasn't about her specific policy positions, but about the example she was setting for millions of others watching at home. If one person could stand up to the machine and win, the unspoken danger was that others might start doing the same. That is the true danger of courage. It is contagious in a way that censorship can never fully contain. As the dust settled and the news cycle eventually moved on, that 37-second clip remained as a testament to what happens when prepared conviction meets hollow narratives. It served as a wake-up call for a political establishment that had grown too comfortable with the idea that they owned specific voting blocks by default. The hearing proved that the era of unquestioned loyalty was fracturing, and the sound of that fracture was the only thing anyone could hear. Candace Owens didn't just leave that room with a victory. She left with a blueprint for how to defeat the narrative of dependency. And as we look back on it now, it is clear that the panic we saw in their eyes was the realization that their grip on the culture was slipping away. The fallout from that day didn't stop when the cameras turned off, because the establishment immediately went into damage control mode to rewrite what had just happened. The morning shows and editorial boards scrambled to frame the exchange as a display of disrespect rather than a dismantling of their narrative. They carefully clipped the video segments, removing the context of her answers to make her appear combative while protecting the image of the committee members. But this strategy backfired in a way they hadn't anticipated, driving even more people to seek out the unedited footage for themselves. The attempt to suppress the truth only acted as an accelerant, proving her point about media manipulation in real time. Beyond the headlines, a quiet shift began to take hold in conversations across the country that the political class never saw coming. Students in university lecture halls who had been afraid to challenge their professors suddenly felt a surge of new courage. Employees sitting through mandatory corporate training sessions realized they weren't alone in their skepticism of the enforced orthodoxy. The hearing became a reference point, a shared cultural moment that signaled it was okay to reject the labels being forced upon them. It wasn't just that Candace had won an argument. It was that she had given others the permission to stop apologizing for their own beliefs. For the strategists on the other side of the aisle, the panic transformed from a momentary shock into a long-term anxiety about the stability of their coalition. They realized that their standard weapon of labeling dissenters as hateful or radical had lost its power when used against someone so undeniably composed. The playbook they had relied on for decades was suddenly obsolete, leaving them without a clear method to counter this new style of opposition. They knew they couldn't debate her on the facts without risking another embarrassment, so they resorted to silence and exclusion. Yet, ignoring her only made her message louder, creating a vacuum that she was more than happy to fill. Candace didn't use this victory to rest or take a victory lap. She used it as fuel to push even further into the uncomfortable truths they wanted to keep hidden. The hearing served as a launch pad, proving that you don't need a teleprompter or a focus group to win if you simply refuse to be intimidated. She demonstrated that the most effective way to handle a bully isn't to negotiate or compromise, but to look them in the eye and speak the truth without wavering. Her refusal to back down became her armor, protecting her from the inevitable attacks that followed in the weeks and months to come. She had walked into the lion's den and walked out not just surviving, but leading. In the end, what happened in that room wasn't just about one woman facing a committee. It was a lesson for everyone watching at home. It showed that the system relies entirely on your compliance and your fear of social ostracization to maintain its control. When you stop fearing their labels and stop playing the role they wrote for you, their power over you evaporates instantly. That is the true legacy of those 37 seconds, and it is a lesson that the establishment is still terrified you will learn. So the next time you feel the pressure to remain silent, remember that moment and ask yourself if you are ready to flip the script.